If you want to become a better artist, the hurdle you need to overcome is finding your voice. If you want your art to be appreciated by others, the hurdle you need to overcome is finding your audience. I'm going to explain how to do both. Finding your voice is a matter of locating or inventing a system of expression by which you can literalize the impressionistic ideas in your mind. This can be extremely difficult as the systems of creation are not often apparent just by looking at the final product of a piece of art. It could be that something which resembles the product in your mind cannot be approached by a system which you naturally comprehend. As you learn the systems which can be used to create something, you can start to recognize your own unique approach to creation, but you may have to study other systems in order to discover how the ideas present in those can be used to modify your own. For example, let's say you read a book which sparks your imagination with how much you relate to one of the characters, and you feel like you could use the medium of fiction yourself to further express your particular worldview, expanding on what was already identified by your favorite author in the creation of your favorite character. However, when you go to start writing your book, you find yourself struggling to describe the setting in which the story takes place. Your favorite author goes into elaborate detail whenever a character walks into a room, and while you tend to get kind of lost reading these sections yourself, you can't conceive of another approach to describing a setting which doesn't seem like it completely fails to put any kind of picture in the reader's head. You do have a picture in your own mind of what the setting should look like, but you just have no idea how to put it into words. So instead you try and draw it. But when faced with a blank page, you have no idea where to start. There's a complete portrait in your mind, but what can you possibly draw first that won't disrupt the way things need to be placed later? You ask a friend of yours who loves to draw how they get started on a new drawing, and they link you to a Bob Ross video. You're not sure how a video teaching you to paint will help you draw, but you trust your friend's wisdom and watch it anyways. Through watching Bob paint, you immediately come to grasp that a work of art doesn't have to begin in the details. It can begin in a base layer of pure color, onto which new impressions are slowly built until all that's left is to fill in the blanks. So instead of drawing any one part of your illustration first, you create a rough outline of the entire thing. Then you go back over it, shifting the vague notions of objects around until they are arranged just right. Then you create concrete outlines for all of the objects and finally start filling them with minute detail. Or maybe, if you're an even more impressionistic thinker, you're so satisfied with the broad concept of the idea that you can't be bothered to fill in the details. Maybe you're already on to the next thing, the next impression that needs to be blasted out of your consciousness to whatever level of craft reflects the length of your attention span. Whatever the case, you're well on the way to finding your voice. Now, being able to express yourself to your own satisfaction might be personally fulfilling, but it doesn't pay the bills, and it certainly doesn't make you feel like anyone else understands you. There might be a few people who you can show your work to who will feel exactly the same way that you do, and others who appreciate it from a different angle that you hadn't even considered, whether they can explain their understanding back to you or not. But unless you can identify the other ways that people internalize ideas and create your art in a way that reaches them, they're never going to understand it to a degree which satisfies either party completely. It's easy to view catering to the understanding of others as filtering your voice, watering it down to make it more accessible, which you would only feel a need to do if the camaraderie of understanding among like-minded people isn't enough for you. Either because you feel the need to be understood even by people who don't think similarly to yourself, or because you know that bridging that communication gap has a higher likelihood of profitability, you are going to need to find a degree to which you can alter your expression in the name of accessibility that doesn't get so far away from your meaning as to no longer approximate it. For example, let's say that you've become a comic artist, telling a dialogue-sparse story about characters exploring densely detailed alien worlds. There's more wide shots than close-ups, and special attention paid to exquisite panel layouts, which have given the comic a reputation as a sensory experience, and scores in the range of high 7s and low 8s from critics, but readership isn't very high. You find a YouTube video where someone bashes your art for being overly stiff, saying that you shouldn't have to stare at a picture for 5 hours appreciating every little hash mark in order to like a comic. Anyone who prefers story-driven material seems to have written it off immediately, even though you've been weaving a rich meta-narrative through the use of flora and fauna on each planet, which your fans have rightly recognized. Why can't you get other people to appreciate it? Even though that kid on YouTube had totally missed the point when trying to describe the themes of your story, and you were on the defensive in your mind most of the way through watching it, there was one insult that stuck with you for hours afterward. It was when he called you self-indulgent. Of course you knew that you didn't need so many lines to communicate the point. You just loved getting lost in filling every little space with color and light so the whole page would radiate. In your mind, any space that could be used for detail might as well be unique from every other space, so long as they all form together cohesively. But it was because of this addiction to detail that you could only publish one chapter every quarter, and had even been pushed into several weeks of crunch time repeatedly throughout the year of the comic's run. On some level, it had even felt like an excuse to you to give yourself more time to work on each chapter, with the reasoning that it took that long to make something perfect. But was this story really perfect? How much had really been said across these 4 chapters in this entire year of publication? How long was it going to take to say as much as this story was meant to say by the end? Intimidated by these thoughts, you are almost relieved when you're asked to wrap up the comic with its next issue. Without any forethought or planning, you decide to launch directly into a 50-page one-shot based on one of the simpler ideas that you've had over the last couple weeks, and give yourself a 1-month time limit to get it done. You even use a calculator to math out exactly how many hours you'll have to work on each page while maintaining the same parameters of an 8-hour workday, 5 days a week. After the first 2 days, you realize this is way more brutal than expected. Your layouts are all built around the assumption that they will be huge, detailed, and beautiful, but in the time you've given yourself, you can barely make it past the layout stage by day's end. Already, you've got to completely rethink your draft storyboard, and you're not even sure this will actually be doable within the time limit. So you start scrolling through Twitter, and then you see someone making a comic utilizing the ability to upload up to 4 images to make each image its own panel of varying size, thus each tweet a sort of page. The comic is barely illustrated, but the characters are all posed dynamically, and their dialogue is fun to read, even if the story isn't especially deep. Each page has a definitive punchline, and before you realize it, you've read 30 of this guy's tweets, and then you notice they were all posted this week. That's when the brain blast comes. You decide to strip everything to the bare essentials and just write on pure instinct, letting whatever ideas come into your mind hit the page as fast as possible and then moving on the instant they reach a stage where you can tell what's happening. Even at the insane pace you're moving compared to normal, you realize that your drawings are still more detailed than the ones you saw online. You can't seem to get them done at the rocket speed that he does, and your punchlines tend to be more dry or poignant than impactful or funny. But you ultimately realize that you really enjoy making this thing. You know you couldn't possibly publish it professionally, but at the end of the month, when you've got a 70-page experimental comic, you release it for free on Twitter. 2 days later, you receive a direct message from a writer whose name you recognize. He's a few years older than you and made a name for himself since breaking on the scene 5 years ago, and you're excited to find out that he's even aware of your existence. Doubly so when you find out that he wants to call you on Discord to talk about your comic. You're expecting him to be trying to hook you up with a publisher or something, but when the conversation begins, it's apparent that he's way more excited about you than you could have expected. He'd enjoyed your quarterly comic already, but when he saw what you were doing with the out-of-control experimental layouts of your Twitter comic, it gave him an idea for the type of story he could tell, which he'd proceeded to think about all night and develop a concept for. Out of just pure interest in his ideas as a fan of the stories of his which you've read, you encourage him to describe his idea, but you're not prepared for the absurd depth of thought this guy has seemingly put into this concept already. It's hard to tell how much he had already written down or what he was coming up with on the spot, but the concept is engrossing, so you simply let him go on and start doodling concepts on your tablet based on parts of his story which stuck out in your imagination. After roughing something out for a couple of minutes, you save it as an image, wait a minute for a break in his train of thought for you to interject, and eventually just toss it up in the chat. He laughs excitedly the second he looks at it and pronounces, "Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about." As you start to get a solid overall impression of his idea, you begin pitching into the conversation more, offering alternatives to what he's saying or building upon his ideas until they're satisfyingly fleshed out. You start to realize that this story is actually a lot more interesting than the one that you had been working on before. In fact, you're shocked by how good and rich of an idea this is shaping up to be. As you rough out some of the settings and a few character concepts, you feel yourself becoming attached to them, and even more compelled to make sure that this idea can be realized than you had ever felt about any of your own work. Question mark, question mark, question mark, profit. Maybe one day you learn to tell your own compelling narratives, or maybe you decide you're best relegated to the drawing side, whatever. These examples are, of course, dramatized, hypothetical portrayals of how one specific comic artist might find their voice and to cultivate it, but there is application to any kind of expression. To best get our ideas out there and connect them to an audience, we need not only to study the systems which others have used to achieve that, but also find new personal ways to combine those techniques into something which works for us and works for the audience, even if it means teaming up with people who think differently to complement our weaknesses. I don't know if I intended to write more of this script because it just kind of ends on a comma, but it seems like it was over. Don't remember when I wrote this, but it was in there. It says last edit was April 26th, so I guess I wrote it in April and never did anything with it. Now you have it.